On a stifling night with no breeze, a wealthy man walks across his property toward an old stone well, carrying his 2-year-old son wrapped in clear plastic like a packaged object. The boy doesn't cry, but his eyes search for light. In the distance, the neigh of a black horse cuts through the silence just before the stable door gives in. The man is only a few steps from the well when the horse appears, blocking his path. No one speaks, no one moves, and in that silence, what happens next defies everything you believe is possible. The white horse stood motionless at the fence line, its steady gaze fixed on the sprawling Kentucky farmhouse as the first light of dawn spilled across the rolling pastures. Phantom, that's what they called him, had been a fixture at Willow Creek Farm for 8 years, as dependable and unwavering as the Blue Ridge Mountains that framed the horizon. His coat gleamed like polished ivory against the emerald landscape, muscles rippling beneath as he shifted his weight, nostrils flaring slightly in the crisp morning air. Inside the farmhouse, Charlotte Reed placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the movement of what the doctors had confirmed were triplets. Her husband, Daniel, moved methodically around the kitchen, preparing coffee in practiced silence. The morning routine was as predictable as the seasons in this part of Kentucky. Coffee at sunrise, a quiet breakfast, followed by Daniel's inspection of their 2,000 acres of prime horse-breeding country. Their marriage had settled into something sturdy and functional, if not passionate, built on shared ambition rather than wild affection. "They're restless this morning," Charlotte said, breaking the silence. Her voice seemed to hang in the air. Between them, Daniel nodded, not looking up from his coffee. Dr. Montgomery said that's normal at this stage. His response was measured like everything else about him. His starched shirts, his precisely combed hair, his methodical approach to building what many considered the finest horse breeding operation in 3 counties. Charlotte watched Phantom through the window. Unlike the other horses that roamed in herds across the pastures, he often stood alone, observant, almost vigilant. "Phantom's at the fence again," she said, more to herself than to Daniel. "That horse has always been peculiar," Daniel replied, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. "Too smart for his own good." 3 months later, Charlotte's labor came weeks earlier than expected. The local hospital wasn't prepared for the complications of a premature triplet birth, and the attending physician's face betrayed his concern long before the first baby emerged. Daniel paced the hallway outside, his composure finally cracking. As the hours wore on, when the doctor finally emerged, his expression was unreadable. "Your wife is stable, Mr. Reed," he said, "and you have 3 healthy boys." Daniel's shoulders relaxed visibly. "When can I see them?" The doctor hesitated. "There's something you should know first. Your sons are, well, they appear to have Asian features, quite pronounced actually." Daniel's face hardened to granite. "That's impossible." But it wasn't impossible. When he finally stood over the hospital bassinets, 3 tiny faces with unmistakably Asian features stared back at him. Charlotte, still groggy from the medication, watched her husband's reaction through half-closed eyes. The silence between them grew vast and impossible to breach. They named the boys Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Biblical names that Daniel insisted upon, as if to impose some semblance of his heritage onto children who clearly carried none of his physical traits. The journey home from the hospital was conducted in silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The farm staff, lined up to welcome the new arrivals, faltered when they saw the infants, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Only Jasmine, the elderly housekeeper who had been with the family since before Daniel inherited the property from his father, stepped forward with genuine warmth. "They're beautiful, Mrs. Reed," she said, peering into each bassinet with a smile that reached her eyes. "Strong little boys." That night, After everyone had retreated to their quarters and the triplets were finally sleeping, Charlotte stood at the nursery window, looking out at the moonlit pasture where Phantom stood sentinel near the fence, his white coat luminous in the darkness. He hadn't moved from that spot since their return, as if keeping watch. Something about his steady presence brought Charlotte a comfort she couldn't explain. The weeks that followed were marked by a silence that grew between Charlotte and Daniel, like a living thing. He spent longer hours in the fields or locked in, his study, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. The staff moved carefully around them, pretending not to notice the growing tension. Charlotte found herself alone with the babies and her thoughts, questions multiplying with no answers forthcoming. Only Luke, the smallest and quietest of the triplets, seemed to sense the unspoken turmoil. While Matthew and Mark thrived in their routine of eating and sleeping, Luke would often lay awake, dark eyes watchful, fussing unless Charlotte carried him to the window that overlooked the pasture where Phantom grazed. There the child would grow calm, his gaze seemingly locked with the white horses, an inexplicable connection that Charlotte found both soothing and vaguely unsettling. 6 months passed in this fragile equilibrium. Daniel maintained a careful politeness in public, playing the role of proud father when neighbors visited, but retreating into cold distance when they were alone. Charlotte's attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic responses or pointed silence. She found herself speaking more freely to Phantom during her morning walks with the triplets than she did to her husband across the dinner table. It was during one such walk, pushing the triplets in their custom-made triple stroller across the dewy grass, that Charlotte noticed something odd. Phantom, normally so gentle and responsive to her presence, suddenly tensed as Daniel approached on his way to the stables. The horse's ears flattened, and he backed away, not in fear, but in what almost appeared to be rejection. "Whoa there. Hey boy," Daniel said, approaching with a halter. "Time for your exercise." Phantom snorted, planting his hooves firmly, refusing to move. Daniel's face darkened. "Don't start this nonsense again." Charlotte watched, puzzled. "Again? Has he been difficult lately?" Daniel shot her a look that closed like a door. "Nothing I can't handle." He reached for Phantom again, but the horse sidestepped, maintaining the exact same distance between them. After several attempts, Daniel cursed under his breath and stormed off toward the stable office, leaving the halter on the ground. Later that afternoon, Charlotte was folding laundry when she heard Luke crying. She hurried to the nursery to find him standing in his crib. He'd learned to pull himself up weeks before his brothers, his small face pressed against the window, tears streaming down his cheeks. Outside, Phantom was being led away by one of the stable hands toward the training area. As soon as Charlotte lifted Luke, his cries intensified, small hands reaching toward the window. "Shh, it's all right," she soothed. But Luke continued to fuss until she carried him downstairs and outside, where he immediately calmed as soon as he could see Phantom again. The horse, sensing their presence, turned his head, pulling against the lead rope until the stable hand relented and led him back toward them. "Sorry, Mrs. Reed," the young man said, clearly uncomfortable. "He's been real stubborn lately, only seems to settle down when you or the little one here are around." Charlotte nodded, bouncing Luke gently as she studied Phantom's intelligent eyes. "It's all right, Jimmy. We'll stay with him for a bit." As Jimmy retreated, Charlotte noticed Daniel, watching from the doorway of the stable office, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he turned abruptly and disappeared inside. That evening, after putting the boys to bed, Charlotte decided to confront the growing strangeness directly. She found Daniel in his study, the single desk lamp casting harsh shadows across his face. "We need to talk about what's happening," she said, closing the door behind her. Daniel didn't look up from the breeding charts spread before him. "Nothing's happening." "The boys are 6 months old, Daniel. You've barely held them, you hardly look at them, and now even Phantom is acting strangely around you. A muscle twitched in Daniel's jaw. That horse has always been stubborn. Not with me, Charlotte said quietly. Not with Luke. Daniel's pen stilled. What exactly are you implying, Charlotte? The question hung between them, dangerous and electric. Charlotte chose her words carefully. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying that something isn't right, and we can't keep pretending otherwise. Those boys, Daniel said, finally meeting her gaze with eyes gone cold, do not look like me. They don't look like you. They don't look like anyone in either of our families. They're our sons, Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. Are they? Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Because I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand how my wife gave birth to 3 children who look nothing like me, nothing like us. The accusation hung unspoken between them. Charlotte felt her cheeks burn with anger. How dare you even think? What am I supposed to think? Daniel's control slipped, his voice rising. Do you have any idea what people are saying, what they're thinking when they see them? I don't care what people think, Charlotte shot back. They're our children. If you can't accept that... Accept what exactly? Daniel laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. That my wife somehow gave birth to children who couldn't possibly be mine, that I should just ignore reality? Charlotte stared at him, a cold realization settling in her stomach. You really believe I was unfaithful? Daniel didn't answer, which was answer enough. I have never been with anyone but you, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Those boys are as much a mystery to me as they are to you. But they are here, they are innocent, and they deserve better than a father who can barely stand to look at them. She turned to leave, but Daniel's next words stopped her cold. There's something I need to show you, he said, his voice suddenly drained of emotion. Tomorrow, after we take the boys to your mother's for the weekend. Charlotte turned back, searching his face. What is it? Just be ready at 9, he said, turning back to his papers. We're going to be gone most of the day. That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She stood at the nursery window again, watching Phantom's white form in the moonlight, steadfast and unwavering. For reasons she couldn't articulate, his presence comforted her, as if he was standing guard not just over the farm, but over secrets buried too deep for words. What do you know? She whispered to the silent sentinel in the pasture. What are you trying to tell us? As if in answer, Phantom raised his head, his gaze seeming to meet hers across the distance, before turning to look toward the old storage barn at the far edge of the property, a building Charlotte had never had reason to enter in all her years at Willow Creek Farm. The morning arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the Kentucky hills, obscuring the boundaries of Willow Creek Farm like a veil between worlds. Charlotte moved through her routine mechanically, packing overnight bags for the triplets while avoiding Daniel's eyes. The boys, now 7 months old, sensed the tension. Matthew and Mark fussed in their high chairs during breakfast, while Luke remained unusually quiet, his dark eyes following Charlotte's movements with an intensity that sometimes unnerved her. I've called my mother, Charlotte said, breaking the silence. She's expecting us by noon. Daniel nodded, his attention fixed on the newspaper before him, though Charlotte noticed he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness she hadn't heard before. I'll drive you there. Then we'll continue on to where I need to show you. The drive to Charlotte's mother's farm in the neighboring county passed in silence, broken only by the occasional babbling from the triplets. Charlotte watched the landscape roll by, autumn painting the trees in fiery hues that reminded her of how much had changed since the previous fall, when her pregnancy had just been confirmed and the future seemed so certain. After dropping off the children, a process Charlotte found more wrenching than expected, they continued driving, heading north toward Lexington. Daniel's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his profile rigid with tension. "Where exactly are we going?" Charlotte finally asked as the countryside gave way to the outskirts of the city. "To see someone who can explain things better than I can," Daniel replied cryptically. They pulled up to a modest medical building on the outskirts of Lexington. The sign read, "Kentucky Reproductive Medicine Associates." Charlotte's confusion deepened as Daniel led her inside, exchanging a few quiet words with the receptionist before they were escorted to a private office in the back. Dr. Eleanor Wilson was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and penetrating blue eyes that missed nothing. She rose from behind her desk when they entered, extending a hand first to Charlotte, then to Daniel. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her voice gentle but direct. "I've been expecting this visit for some time now." Charlotte shot a questioning look at Daniel, who had taken a seat by the window, his gaze fixed on the parking lot below. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Have we met before?" "No," Dr. Wilson replied, resuming her seat and gesturing for Charlotte to do the same. "But I worked with your husband nearly 10 years ago, before your marriage. And more recently, I consulted on your fertility case, though we never met in person." Charlotte's mind raced to make sense of the doctor's words. "My fertility case? But I never had fertility issues. We conceived naturally after 3 years of trying," Daniel interrupted, finally turning to face them. 3 years of disappointment every month." Charlotte stared at him. "Yes, but we didn't seek medical help. It just happened. Naturally." Dr. Wilson exchanged a glance with Daniel before opening a file on her desk. "Mrs. Reed, do you recall undergoing a minor procedure about 4 years ago? You were told it was to remove a small cyst." A cold sensation spread through Charlotte's chest. "Yes, at Central Kentucky Medical, but what does that have to do with—" "That wasn't just a cyst removal," Daniel said, his voice flat. "It was egg retrieval for IVF." The words hung in the air between them, incomprehensible at first, then slowly taking terrible shape. Charlotte shook her head. "No, that's not possible. I would remember something like that." "111. You were given medication that causes temporary memory suppression," Dr. Wilson explained gently. "It's not standard practice, but your husband insisted it was necessary for your emotional well-being, given your previous anxieties about conception." Charlotte felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. She gripped the arms of her chair, struggling to breathe. "You drugged me? You had them take my eggs without my knowledge or consent?" Daniel wouldn't meet her eyes. "I did what I thought was best. You were becoming obsessed with getting pregnant. The disappointment was crushing you month after month." "So you violated my body instead?" Charlotte's voice rose. "How could you possibly think—" "Mrs. Reed," Dr. Wilson interrupted softly, "there's more you need to know." Charlotte turned to the doctor, tears of anger and betrayal blurring her vision. What more could there possibly be? Dr. Wilson slid a document across the desk. "This is a consent form for IVF using donor eggs. The signature is yours, though I suspect you have no memory of signing it." Charlotte stared at the familiar loops and curves of what was undeniably her signature. I never... The form was signed during a follow-up appointment," Daniel said. "After the egg retrieval, you were still under the influence of the medication." A wave of nausea washed over Charlotte. Why? Why would you do this?" Daniel finally met her gaze, his expression a complex mixture of guilt and defiance. "Your eggs weren't viable. We tried 3 cycles with them, but none took. The specialist said it was unlikely you'd ever conceive with your own eggs. So you decided to use someone else's without telling me." Charlotte's voice broke on the last words. I used a donor, Daniel confirmed. Someone I knew would give us healthy children. Dr. Wilson cleared her throat. This is where I must clarify something, Mrs. Reed. Your husband did select a donor, but the embryos that were ultimately implanted were not created with his sperm. The silence that followed was absolute. Charlotte looked from the doctor to Daniel, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. I don't understand. Daniel stood abruptly, moving to the window again. There was a mix-up at the lab. They used someone else's sperm with the donor eggs. By the time they discovered the mistake, you were already pregnant. Charlotte felt as though she were underwater, sounds muffled, thoughts slowed to a crawl. So the triplets are not biologically related to either of you, Dr. Wilson finished gently. Though they were carried in your womb, Mrs. Reed, you are their birth mother in every sense that matters. Charlotte closed her eyes, memories flooding. Back, the exhaustion of the pregnancy, the premature birth, the shock on Daniel's face when he first saw the boys. The silent accusation in his eyes every day since. The donor, she said finally, opening her eyes. The egg donor. Who was she? Daniel and Dr. Wilson exchanged another glance. Her name was Lin May, Daniel said quietly. She was my research assistant during my graduate work in animal genetics. She needed money for her mother's medical treatments back in China. Charlotte felt something click into place, a missing piece in a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. You knew her. You knew her well. It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered anyway. Yes, we worked closely for several years. Dr. Wilson interjected softly. Mrs. Reed, I understand this is overwhelming information. Perhaps we should continue this conversation another. No, Charlotte cut her off, her voice steadier than she felt. I want to know everything. Now, who was the sperm donor, the one they used by mistake? Dr. Wilson consulted her file again. That information is confidential. The donor was anonymous, though our records indicate he was of Korean descent. Charlotte laughed, a sound devoid of humor. So my husband arranged for his former research assistant to donate her eggs, which were then fertilized by an unknown Korean man's sperm and implanted in me without my knowledge or consent. She stood, surprising herself with how calm she felt. Is there anything else I should know about my own life, Doctor? Any other decisions that were made for me? Dr. Wilson lowered her eyes. I can only apologize for my part in this, Mrs. Reed. Medical ethics have evolved significantly in the past few years. What happened would not be permitted under today's standards. Charlotte turned to Daniel, who still stood by the window, shoulders hunched like a man bracing against a storm. And Lin May? Does she know what happened to her eggs? That there are 3 children out there with her genes? Daniel's silence was answer enough. I want to meet her, Charlotte said, the words surprising even herself. That's not possible, Daniel replied, turning to face her. She returned to China years ago, after she donated the eggs. Something in his tone made Charlotte pause. Are you sure about that? Because something tells me there's still more you're not telling me. Before Daniel could respond, Charlotte's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her mother's number. A spike of fear shot through her as she answered. Mom, is everything okay with the boys? Her mother's voice came through high and strained. Charlotte, you need to come back. It's Luke. He's running a high fever, and he's been crying for hours. I think we need to take him to the hospital. Charlotte was already moving toward the door. We're on our way. Call Dr. Jameson. Tell him we're bringing Luke in. The drive back was a blur, with Daniel pushing the speed limit on the country roads. Charlotte stared out the window, her mind racing between concern for Luke and the shocking revelations of the morning. Willow Creek Farm appeared through the trees, and Charlotte caught a glimpse of White in the pasture, Phantom, standing at attention near the fence line, as if waiting for their return. At her mother's house, they found Luke flushed with fever, his small body radiating heat. Matthew and Mark watched wide-eyed from their playpen as Charlotte gathered Luke into her arms. "It came on so suddenly," her mother explained, wringing her hands. "He was fine one minute, then burning up the next, and he keeps reaching for something that isn't there." In the car to the pediatrician's office, Luke's fevered cries gradually subsided as they approached Willow Creek Farm. By the time they passed the entrance, he had grown almost calm, his glassy eyes fixed on something outside. The window. Charlotte followed his gaze and saw Phantom galloping alongside the fence line, parallel to the road, keeping pace with their car. "Daniel, slow down," she said. "We need to get him to the doctor," Daniel replied, accelerating instead. "Just trust me, slow down." Something in her voice made Daniel comply. As the car slowed, Phantom drew closer to the fence, his white coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Luke's small hand pressed against the window, and remarkably, his crying stopped completely. "He's connecting with the horse," Charlotte said softly, "just like he always does." Daniel watched the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "It's just a coincidence." But it wasn't a coincidence when Dr. Jameson found nothing physically wrong with Luke after a thorough examination. "Sometimes these fevers come and go quickly in infants," he explained, removing his stethoscope. "His lungs are clear, ears look good, no signs of infection, just keep him hydrated and comfortable." By the time they returned home, Luke's temperature had returned to normal. Charlotte carried him to the nursery window that overlooked the pasture, where Phantom had resumed his vigilant position. The horse raised his head, meeting her gaze across the distance. "You knew," she whispered to the animal. "Somehow, you knew all along." That night, after the boys were asleep, Charlotte stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one above the rolling Kentucky hills. She heard Daniel's footsteps behind her but didn't turn. "We need to finish our conversation," she said quietly. "I know." Daniel leaned against the porch railing, keeping a careful distance between them. "But not tonight. You've had enough shocks for one day." Charlotte turned to face him, studying the man she had married, the man she thought she knew. "Just tell me one thing, Lynn May, did you love her?" The question hung in the night air between them. Daniel's silence stretched so long, Charlotte thought he might not answer. "Yes," he finally said, the word barely audible above the chorus of night insects. "But it was impossible. My father would never have accepted her. The farm, the family, name, it all would have gone to my cousin if I had chosen her." Charlotte nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "So you chose the farm instead, and then you chose me." "It wasn't like that," Daniel protested. "I did love you, Charlotte. I do love you." "But you loved her first," Charlotte said, surprising herself with how little pain the realization brought. "And you tried to keep a piece of her through those eggs." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I never expected the mix-up. When I saw the boys, when I realized they weren't—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I should have told you everything from the beginning." "Yes, you should have." Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself against the autumn chill. "Tomorrow, I want you to show me everything, whatever else you're hiding. No more secrets." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "There's a storage room in the old barn. Lynn's things. I kept some of them, letters, photographs." "And does Lynn know about the triplets?" Charlotte pressed. A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "No, she doesn't know." But something in his expression, a flicker of evasion Charlotte had. Come to recognize over their years together told her this wasn't the full truth either. She turned back to the darkness, to the white shape of Phantom still standing watch in the moonlit pasture. "Tomorrow," she said firmly. "Everything comes to light tomorrow." As if in answer, Phantom's soft nickering carried across the night air, a sound that seemed to Charlotte like both a warning and a promise. The old storage barn stood at the far edge of Willow Creek Farm, its weathered boards silver-gray against the morning sky. Charlotte approached it slowly, conscious of Daniel's reluctance as he followed a few paces behind, keys jangling in his hand. They had left the triplets with Jasmine after breakfast, with strict instructions to call if Luke's fever returned. "I haven't been in here for years," Daniel said as he struggled with the padlock. "Not since before we were married." The heavy door groaned on rusted hinges, releasing the musty scent of dust and forgotten things. Shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom through gaps in the roof boards, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Charlotte stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the dimness. The space was cluttered with the accumulated debris of generations, broken farm equipment, stacks of moldering feed bags, tarnished trophies from long-ago horse shows. Daniel moved with purpose toward the back corner, where a wooden staircase led to a small loft. "Up there," he said, gesturing for Charlotte to go first. The loft was cleaner than the space below, as if it had been preserved while the rest of the barn surrendered to neglect. A narrow cot with a faded quilt stood against one wall. Beside it, a small desk and chair, both covered in a fine layer of dust. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes on genetics, horse breeding, and scientific journals. This was her space, Daniel said quietly, remaining by the stairs. "Lynn lived here during the summers she worked with me. My father wouldn't allow her in the main house." Charlotte ran her fingers along the desk's surface, leaving trails in the dust. "She lived in a barn, like a servant." Daniel's expression darkened. "It was all I could manage without my father suspecting how I felt about her. He was still alive then, still running everything." Charlotte nodded slowly, picturing the Reed, family patriarch, a stern-faced man whose portrait still hung in the main hallway of the farmhouse. William Reed had been known throughout the county for two things: his prize-winning horses and his thinly veiled prejudices. "Where did she go?" Charlotte asked, opening a desk drawer to find it empty. "After she donated the eggs." Daniel moved to the bookshelf, pulling out a volume and extracting a manila envelope hidden behind it. "Back to China, like I told you. To Hangzhou. Her mother was sick, and the money from the donation paid for treatment." He handed Charlotte the envelope. Inside were photographs, Daniel younger and smiling beside a petite woman with delicate features and intelligent eyes. In many of the photos, Phantom appeared as a young colt, often nuzzling the woman's shoulder or following close behind her. Phantom was hers, Charlotte realized aloud. That's why he behaves so differently with you now. He belonged to Lynn first. Daniel nodded. She raised him from birth. Her research project was on early imprinting in foals. When she left, she couldn't take him with her, of course. She made me promise to keep him safe. Charlotte studied the photographs more carefully. In one, Lynn stood proudly beside a newborn, Phantom, whose spindly legs and fuzzy coat contrasted with his now powerful frame. The woman's expression was one of pure joy, her hand gently cradling the foal's head. "She loved him," Charlotte said softly. "She loved everything about this place," Daniel replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "The hills, the streams, the open sky, everything except my father." Charlotte set the photos aside and looked at Daniel directly. "When was the last time you spoke with her?" The question hung between them, charged with unspoken suspicions. Daniel moved to the small window that overlooked the pastures, his back to Charlotte. I received a letter from her about 5 years ago, he admitted. She was finishing her doctorate at Beijing Agricultural University. She asked about Phantom. And I replied, told her he was doing well. Daniel's shoulders tensed. That was it. Charlotte sensed the lie but didn't press. Instead, she continued exploring the loft, pausing at a small trunk tucked under the cot. What's in here? Daniel turned, frowning. I don't know. I never looked through her personal things. The trunk wasn't locked. Charlotte lifted the lid to find neatly folded clothes, a few books in Chinese, and at the bottom, a small lacquered box. She removed it carefully, feeling Daniel's attention sharpen. I don't think we should, he began, but Charlotte had already opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them tied with faded ribbon. Some were addressed to Lin at various universities in China, others to Lin May Reed at Willow Creek Farm. Charlotte froze, the name jumping out at her like an accusation. Reed, she whispered, looking up at Daniel. Were you? No, Daniel said quickly. We weren't married. She just used the name sometimes to make things easier with deliveries and local business. My father never knew. Charlotte lifted out the stack of letters addressed to the farm, noting the postmarks from the past 7 years, all well after Lin supposedly returned to China, all during Charlotte's marriage to Daniel. You've been in contact with her all this time, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. These are recent. Daniel didn't deny it. Yes. Does she know about me? About our marriage? Yes. And the triplets? Charlotte pressed. Does she know about them? Daniel hesitated, then moved to sit heavily on the cot beside her. She knows you gave birth to triplets. She doesn't know they were created with her eggs. Charlotte tried to make sense of this new deception. So all these years, while I believed we were building a life together, you've been maintaining a relationship with another woman, a woman whose eggs were used to create our children without either of our knowledge. It wasn't a relationship, Daniel protested, just letters. She was my friend, my colleague, nothing more, not after she left. Then why hide it? Charlotte demanded. Why keep everything about her secret? The letters, the photographs, her connection to Phantom? Daniel had no answer. Charlotte returned to the letters, noticing something odd. These are all from Lin to you. Where are your responses? I kept them separate, Daniel said, in the safe in my study. Charlotte continued sorting through the box, stopping when she found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a delicate jade pendant in the shape of a horse, almost identical to a wooden trinket Luke had been drawn to in a store window the previous week. The coincidence sent a shiver down her spine. There's more, Daniel said finally, moving to the bookcase again and pulling several books forward to reveal a hidden compartment in the wall behind them. From it, he extracted a small leather-bound journal. This is Lin's research diary, her observations about Phantom from birth through his first year. Charlotte accepted the book, opening it to find pages of meticulous notes in elegant handwriting, accompanied by sketches of Phantom at various stages of development. Interspersed with the scientific observations were more personal entries, Lin's thoughts, her growing attachment to the foal, and increasingly, her feelings for Daniel. I didn't know this was here, Daniel said, watching Charlotte turn the pages. I found it after she left. I should have sent it to her, but you wanted to keep a piece of her, Charlotte finished, understanding despite herself. She continued reading, stopping abruptly at an entry dated just weeks before Lin's departure. Dee has asked the impossible. His father grows more suspicious. Each day, the whispers among the staff have reached his ears. Dee says I must go. that it's the only way to protect what we've built. He promises it's temporary, that once the old man is gone, everything will change. I believe him, but my heart breaks at leaving Phantom. The foal has become my shadow, more attuned to my emotions than any human could be. I fear what my absence will do to him, to us both. Charlotte looked up from the journal, a cold realization settling in her chest. You sent her away because your father discovered your relationship. Daniel nodded, eyes fixed on the dusty floorboards. He threatened to disinherit me, to sell off the farm piece by piece if I continued seeing her. Said he'd rather burn it all down than see it go to mixed-blood children. So you chose the farm, Charlotte said, the words carrying the weight of everything that had followed from that decision. Again, I thought it was temporary, Daniel said, his voice hollow. I was going to bring her back after he died, but then you met me, Charlotte finished. Daniel's silence was confirmation enough. And the fertility treatments? The egg donation? Was that your way of keeping your promise to her in some twisted fashion? No, Daniel said, shaking his head vehemently. That was never the plan. When we couldn't conceive naturally, I thought of Lynn because I knew her family medical history, her intelligence. It seemed logical. Logical, Charlotte repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. And did you plan to tell me any of this, ever? Before Daniel could answer, Charlotte's phone rang. Jasmine calling. Her heart jumped to her throat. Is it Luke? She answered without preamble. No, Mrs. Reed, the boys are fine. Jasmine's voice came through, tinged with confusion. But there's a situation. Phantom broke through the pasture fence about 20 minutes ago. The stable hands can't find him anywhere on the property. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Daniel. We'll be right there. They hurried back to the main house, finding the staff in a state of commotion. Jimmy, the young stable hand, jogged up to meet them, his face flushed with exertion. Never seen anything like it, Mr. Reed, he reported breathlessly. That fence was solid steel posting. He shouldn't have been able to break through, but he went right through the north corner by the old oak. Which direction did he go? Daniel demanded. Heading west toward the state road, another worker called. Tom's already taken the truck out looking. Charlotte felt a sudden urgency. The triplets, where are they? In the nursery with Ms. Jasmine, Jimmy replied. But Charlotte was already running toward the house. She burst into the nursery to find Jasmine rocking Matthew and Mark, who were fussing irritably. The third crib stood empty. Where's Luke? Charlotte demanded, panic rising in her throat. Jasmine's eyes widened in alarm. He was right here. I just stepped out for a moment to get their bottles ready. The window beside Luke's crib stood open, the light curtains billowing in the breeze. Daniel! Charlotte screamed, rushing to the window. The drop to the ground was 8 feet at least, too far for a baby to survive without injury. But there, on the grassy area below, she saw tiny handprints and knee prints, as if something or someone had broken the fall. Daniel appeared beside her, taking in the scene with growing horror. How could he have gotten out? He can't even walk properly yet. He crawls, Charlotte said, already racing for the stairs, and he's been pulling himself up on furniture for weeks. Outside, they found more disturbances in the dewy grass, small impressions leading away from the house toward the broken section of fence Jimmy had described. Daniel and Charlotte followed the trail, joined by several farm workers who spread out across the field. It's impossible, Daniel kept saying. No baby could get this far on his own. But Charlotte had stopped listening, focusing instead on a flash of white moving through the trees at the western edge of the property. There, she pointed. Phantom! They ran toward the tree line, Charlotte's heart hammering against her ribs. As they drew closer, she saw the white horse standing patiently beside a fallen log. And there, nestled against Phantom's front legs, sat Luke, small hands tangled in the horse's mane, face upturned to the animal in perfect contentment. Luke! Charlotte cried, rushing forward. Phantom remained motionless as she approached, dark, eyes watching her without alarm. Only when Charlotte reached for Luke did the horse shift slightly, as if reluctant to relinquish his charge. "It's okay, boy," she soothed, gathering Luke into her arms. "I've got him now." The baby seemed unhurt, his face breaking into a wide smile at the sight of his mother. Charlotte checked him over frantically. No cuts, no bruises, not even a scratch despite the impossible journey from nursery window to forest edge. Daniel caught up, panting, his face ashen. "Is he all right?" "He's fine," Charlotte said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Completely fine." Phantom nickered softly, nudging Luke's foot with his nose. The baby reached out, tiny fingers seeking the horse's muzzle. He was protecting him, Charlotte said, watching the interaction with wonder. Somehow, he knew Luke needed help. Daniel stared at the horse, then at the baby, confusion evident in his expression. But how did Luke even get out of the house, and why would Phantom... A new voice interrupted from behind them. "Because Phantom recognizes what you've been trying so hard to deny, Daniel." Charlotte turned, shock rippling through her at the sight of the petite Asian woman standing at the edge of the clearing. Though older than in the photographs, her features were unmistakable. The same intelligent eyes, the same quiet dignity. "Lynn," Daniel breathed, the name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. The woman stepped forward, her gaze moving from Daniel to Charlotte, then settling on Luke with an expression of such profound tenderness that Charlotte instinctively tightened her hold on the baby. "You remember me?" Lynn said to Phantom, approaching the horse with an outstretched hand. The animal whickered softly, pressing his muzzle into her palm. "And you," she continued, turning to Charlotte, "must be the woman who gave birth to my children." The words hung in the clearing, a truth finally spoken aloud. Charlotte felt the world tilt beneath her feet, but she remained standing, Luke secure in her arms. "How long have you known?" she asked. Lynn's smile was sad. "Since the beginning. There are no secrets in small towns, Mrs. Reed, especially not on horse farms where the staff have eyes and ears everywhere." Daniel stepped forward. "Lynn, I can explain." "Can you?" Lynn's voice hardened slightly. "Can you explain why you told me the eggs were never used? Why you let me believe they were destroyed after the trials failed?" She turned back to Charlotte. "Or why you kept this woman in the dark about everything, about me, about the eggs, about our past?" Charlotte studied the woman before her. This stranger who was, in the most fundamental biological sense, the mother of her children. "Why are you here now? After all this time?" Lynn reached into her pocket, extracting an envelope worn thin with handling. "Because 1 month ago I received this, a letter from someone at the fertility clinic, telling me that my eggs were not only used successfully, but had resulted in the birth of triplets." She paused, her eyes meeting Charlotte's directly. "My letter to Daniel demanding answers was returned unopened." Charlotte turned to her husband, watching as the last of his carefully constructed facade crumbled. "Who sent the letter from the clinic?" she asked. "Dr. Wilson," Daniel admitted, shoulders slumping. "She called me, said she could no longer be complicit in keeping this from both of you, said her conscience wouldn't allow it." "So you knew Lynn was coming," Charlotte realized. "That's why you suddenly decided to tell me everything yesterday." Daniel nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I thought if I controlled how you found out." "You could control my reaction," Charlotte finished, "just like you've tried to control everything else." Lynn stepped closer, her attention focused on Luke, who had begun reaching toward her with unmistakable curiosity. "May I?" she asked softly. Charlotte hesitated, then slowly extended her arms, allowing Lynn to see the baby more clearly. Luke's dark eyes studied the newcomer with the same intense focus he usually reserved for Phantom. "He has my father's eyes," Lynn whispered, one finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. "I would know them anywhere." Charlotte felt a strange mixture of emotions: fear, jealousy, and underneath it all, an unexpected sense of connection to this woman who had carried the same genetic material that now shaped the faces of her sons. "There's something else you should know," she said, glancing at Daniel before continuing. "The clinic made a mistake. The sperm used wasn't Daniel's. The boys aren't biologically related to either of us, only to you." Lynn's eyes widened in surprise. "Then who?" "An anonymous donor," Charlotte explained, "of Korean descent, according to Dr. Wilson." She paused, watching Luke reach out to touch Lynn's jade pendant, identical to the one they'd found in the lacquered box. "Though perhaps not as anonymous as we've been led to believe." Lynn's sharp intake of breath confirmed Charlotte's suspicion. Her gaze snapped to Daniel, who had gone very still. "Jung-ho," Lynn said, the name clearly significant. "You used Jung-ho's sperm." Daniel didn't deny it. "Who is Jung-ho?" Charlotte asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "My husband," Lynn replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "My husband, who passed away 4 years ago from the same heart condition that took my father." The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. "That's why you were so concerned when Luke had his fever," Charlotte said to Daniel. "You knew about the family history of heart problems." Daniel's silence was damning. "So the triplets," Charlotte continued, working through the implications, "are biologically the children you would have had with Lynn if you had chosen her over the farm, if you had defied your father." "The children we did have," Lynn corrected gently, "through you, Mrs. Reed." Charlotte felt dizzy with the weight of the revelation. Luke, sensing her distress, began to fuss, tiny hands reaching for her face. "What happens now?" she asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Phantom answered with a soft nickering, moving to stand between the 3 adults, his presence somehow both a barrier and a bridge. Luke immediately calmed at the sound of the horse's gentle rumble. "First," Lynn said, her practical nature asserting itself, "we should get this little one back to the house. It's getting cold out here." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Phantom following close behind, Charlotte felt the foundations of her life shifting once more. But this time, instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the chaos, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally finding their proper places. Behind them, the old storage barn stood as a silent witness to the past. Ahead, the main house waited, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, the future unwritten but undeniably changed. Winter descended on Willow Creek Farm, transforming the rolling Kentucky landscape into a canvas of whites and grays. The triplets, now approaching their first birthday, thrived despite the upheaval that had redefined their family. Matthew and Mark had begun taking their first tentative steps, chasing each other around the farmhouse living room on wobbling legs, while Luke, still more observer than participant, watched from his favorite spot near the window that overlooked Phantom's paddock. 3 months had passed since Lynn May's arrival. 3 months of difficult conversations, painful revelations, and gradual tentative rebuilding. Charlotte stood at the kitchen window, watching snowflakes drift lazily from a pearl-gray sky, reflecting on how completely her life had changed in such a short time. "Coffee?" Lynn asked, appearing beside her with 2 steaming mugs. Charlotte accepted with a grateful smile. "Thanks. Did the boys finally go down for their nap?" "Matthew fought it as usual," Lynn replied, leaning against the counter, "but he surrendered eventually." The easy domesticity between them still sometimes caught Charlotte by surprise. What had begun as the most awkward of arrangements, Lynn Staying in the guest cottage while they all figured out what came next had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but something uniquely their own. "Daniel called," Charlotte said, sipping her coffee. "His flight from Lexington to Beijing got delayed. He won't be back until next Tuesday." Lynn nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Did he say how the meetings went? With the agricultural delegation?" "Apparently they're very interested in his breeding program and in your research." The horse breeding operation that had once been Daniel's exclusive domain had transformed over the past months, incorporating Lynn's innovative genetic research. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, that the work Lynn and Daniel had begun together a decade earlier was finally coming to fruition, but under circumstances none of them could have imagined. "I should go check on Phantom," Lynn said after a moment of companionable silence. "The vet said to watch that cut on his foreleg carefully." Charlotte nodded, watching as Lynn bundled up in one of Daniel's old parkas before heading out to the stables. Through the window, she saw Phantom's white head appear over his stall door, ears pricked forward in recognition as Lynn approached. The sound of soft babbling drew Charlotte's attention back inside. Luke had awakened early from his nap and crawled into the kitchen, dark eyes serious in his small face. "Hey there, little man," Charlotte said, lifting him into her arms. "You're supposed to be sleeping." Luke patted her cheek, then pointed insistently toward the window, toward the stables where Lynn had disappeared. "You want to see Phantom?" Charlotte asked, receiving an enthusiastic nod in response. "All right, but just for a few minutes. It's cold out there." Bundled in layers of winter clothing, Luke resembled a tiny astronaut as Charlotte carried him across the snow-covered yard to the main stable. Inside, the familiar smells of hay, horses, and leather created a warm counterpoint to the crisp winter air. Phantom's stall was at the far end, where Lynn was carefully examining the healing cut on his leg. "We have a visitor," Charlotte announced, approaching with Luke, who was practically vibrating with excitement. Lynn looked up with a smile. "He always knows when Phantom needs checking, doesn't he? Like they have some secret communication system." Charlotte set Luke down on a clean patch of straw, keeping a careful hand on his back as he reached toward the horse. Phantom lowered, his great head gentle and deliberate, allowing the child to pat his soft muzzle. "I've never seen anything like their connection," Charlotte admitted, watching as Luke babbled seriously to the horse, who seemed to listen with equal gravity. "Sometimes I think they understand each other better than we understand. Either of them." Lynn nodded, tightening a fresh bandage around Phantom's leg. "In my research, I documented cases of extraordinary bonds between horses and humans, but this," she gestured to Luke and Phantom, "this goes beyond anything in the scientific literature." Charlotte thought back to that day 3 months ago when Phantom had somehow known that Luke needed protection, had somehow facilitated the baby's impossible journey from nursery window to forest edge without injury. "Do you think it has something to do with genetics? With him being biologically yours and Jung Ho's?" she asked, voicing a question that had lingered unspoken between them. Lynn considered this, her scientist's mind evident in her careful response. "I don't believe genetics can explain this particular connection. Jung Ho never had any special affinity for horses." A wistful smile crossed her features. "In fact, he was a little afraid of them at first." Charlotte absorbed this, watching as Luke leaned his head against Phantom's muzzle, both child and horse seeming to take comfort in the contact. "Then what is it? What makes them so connected?" "Perhaps it's simpler than we're making it," Lynn suggested. "Phantom was with you throughout your pregnancy. He stood watch during the difficult months after the boys were born, when Daniel withdrew and you were struggling. Maybe Luke sensed that presence, that protection, even before he was fully conscious of it." The theory made a certain intuitive sense, though Charlotte suspected there were depths to the bond between her son and the horse that neither she nor Lynn would ever fully comprehend. A sudden commotion at the stable entrance drew their attention. Jimmy, the stable hand, burst in, his young face flushed with urgency. "Mrs. Reed, you need to come quick. There's been an accident on the North Road. A car slid off into Potter's Creek. Miss Jasmine sent me to fetch you. Says you should bring blankets and the first aid kit from the tack room." Charlotte's heart raced as she scooped up Luke. "Who is it? Do we know?" "A woman and a little girl," Jimmy replied, already moving to gather the supplies. "Their car went right through the ice. Old Mr. Benson pulled them out, but they're half frozen. Miss Jasmine's got them in the main house now." Charlotte and Lynn exchanged a quick glance before springing into action. Lynn took Luke while Charlotte grabbed the farm's extensive first aid kit, designed for both human and equine emergencies. Outside, the gentle snowfall had intensified into near whiteout conditions. "The road should have been closed hours ago," Lynn said as they hurried toward the main house, shielding Luke from the stinging snow. Inside, they found controlled chaos. Jasmine directed two farm workers who were stoking the great stone fireplace in the living room to blazing life. On the hearthrug lay a slender woman wrapped in every blanket the household could muster, her dark hair plastered to her deathly pale face. Beside her, a little girl of perhaps 3 or 4 years sat in shocked silence, clutching a sodden stuffed rabbit, her lips tinged an alarming shade of blue. "I've called for an ambulance," Jasmine reported, taking Luke from Lynn's arms. "But in this weather, who knows when they'll get here?" Charlotte knelt beside the little girl, speaking softly. "Hi there. My name's Charlotte. We're going to help you get warm, okay?" The child stared at her with huge, frightened eyes, but didn't respond. "She hasn't said a word since they pulled her out," Jasmine explained. "Poor little mite's in shock, I expect." "We need to get them out of these wet clothes," Lynn said, her practical nature taking charge. "Then raise their core temperature gradually. Too fast could cause cardiac problems." While Lynn attended to the unconscious woman, Charlotte gently coaxed the little girl out of her soaked coat and dress, wrapping her in warm, dry blankets fresh from the dryer. The child remained silent throughout, her eyes darting between Charlotte and her mother's still form. "Your mommy's going to be okay," Charlotte reassured her, though she had no way of knowing if this was true. "My friend is helping her right now. She's very smart." Lynn looked up from her examination of the woman. Her pulse is steady but slow. Breathing is shallow but regular. "I don't see any obvious injuries besides some bruising and minor cuts. It's the hypothermia we need to worry about." As if in response to Lynn's assessment, the woman stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering. The little girl immediately tried to scramble toward her mother, nearly tumbling from Charlotte's lap in her eagerness. "Mama!" The word burst from her like the breaking of a dam. The woman's eyes opened fully at the sound, disorientation giving way to sharp concern. "Olivia, where? You're safe," Charlotte soothed, helping the little girl named Olivia move closer to her mother. "You had an accident on the North Road. Your car went into the creek, but you're both safe now." Recognition slowly dawned in the woman's eyes as she took in her surroundings. The grand farmhouse living room, with its soaring ceilings and antique furniture, the blazing fire, the circle of concerned faces. "Willow Creek Farm," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made it." Charlotte exchanged a glance with Lynn, both puzzled by the statement. "You were coming here? To the farm?" The woman managed a weak nod, pulling her daughter close with trembling arms. "My name is Sophia Kim. I've been trying to reach this place for 3 days, but the weather..." She trailed off, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. Lynn knelt beside them, her expression carefully neutral. "You're Korean American?" Sophia nodded, studying Lin's face with growing intensity. "And you're Lin Mei. I recognize you from the photos." An electric tension filled the room. Charlotte felt the hair rise on the back of her neck as Lin asked, very softly, "What photos, Mrs. Kim?" "The ones in my husband's research journals," Sophia replied. "Jung-ho spoke of you often, said you were the most brilliant colleague he ever had." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft whimpering of Olivia, who had burrowed against her mother's side, thumb firmly in mouth. "Jung-ho Kim was your husband," Lin said finally, the words more statement than question. "Yes." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "He passed away 4 years ago, heart failure, just like his father." Charlotte felt the room tilt slightly, her mind racing to process this new revelation. "But I thought we were told that Jung-ho was Lin's husband," Sophia finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. "No, they were research partners at Beijing Agricultural University. Close friends but never married." Lin had gone very still, her composure finally cracking. "I don't understand. Daniel Reed told you what suited his purposes," Sophia said, a flash of anger giving strength to her voice. "Just as he told the fertility clinic that he had consent forms from all parties involved." Charlotte sank into a nearby chair, trying to make sense of this new layer of deception. "But why would he?" "Because he needed Lin's eggs and Jung-ho's sperm," Sophia said simply. "He needed to recreate what he believed was the perfect genetic combination for his purposes." "His purposes?" Lin echoed, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. "The breeding program," Charlotte realized suddenly, pieces clicking into horrible place. "Not just for horses. He was applying the same principles to—" She couldn't finish the thought. Too monstrous to voice with the triplets, sleeping just upstairs. "To create children with specific genetic traits," Sophia confirmed grimly. "Jung-ho discovered what Daniel was planning just before he passed away. He left me a letter explaining everything, but it took me years to find the courage to come forward." Lin stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the stables, her slender frame rigid with tension. "The perfect combination of East and West," she said, her voice hollow. "That's what he used to say about our research approach. I thought he meant our methodologies." Charlotte felt physically ill, her gaze moving to Luke, who had been watching the proceedings with unusual focus from Jasmine's lap. The revelations cast everything in a new, disturbing light. Daniel's obsession with the farm's legacy, his initially cold response to the triplets, his careful control of information. "I don't understand why Jung-ho would agree to donate sperm in the first place," she said, focusing on the practical to keep from being overwhelmed. "If he was married to you, why would he—" "He didn't," Sophia interrupted. "At least not for Daniel's purposes. Jung-ho and I were struggling with infertility. He made a deposit at a fertility clinic in Lexington during a research trip, intended for our own use. Somehow, Daniel gained access to it." "Dr. Wilson," Charlotte murmured, remembering the silver-haired doctor who had been complicit in so much deception. She must have helped him. A small sound from the doorway drew everyone's attention. Matthew and Mark stood there in their sleep clothes, clearly awakened by the commotion. Behind them, Daniel's elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, appeared, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Reed. They woke up and went looking for you. I couldn't keep them upstairs." Charlotte beckoned the boys forward, gathering them close as she tried to shield them from the tension in the room. Matthew immediately climbed into her lap, while Mark moved cautiously toward the strangers by the fire, curious as always. Olivia perked up at the sight of the toddlers, her earlier fear giving way to childish interest. "Babies," she pronounced solemnly, reaching out a small hand toward Mark. Mark responded with a delighted smile, offering Olivia the toy car he'd been clutching. The simple, innocent interaction cut through the heaviness in the room, reminding them all of what truly mattered amid the tangled web of adult deceptions. Sophia watched the children with soft eyes. When Jung-ho learned what Daniel had done, using the genetic material without consent, manipulating everyone involved, his heart condition worsened dramatically. The stress... She trailed off, swallowing hard. His last wish was that I find the children, make sure they were safe and loved. Charlotte tightened her hold on Matthew, her maternal instinct flaring. They are loved. Whatever Daniel did, whatever his motivations, these boys are cherished. I can see that, Sophia assured her. That's all Jung-ho would have wanted. He wasn't looking to disrupt lives or take them away from their home. Lynn returned from the window, her composure restored, though her eyes revealed her inner turmoil. The snow's getting worse. No ambulance will make it through tonight. She knelt beside Sophia again, checking her pulse. You and Olivia should stay here until the road's clear. We have plenty of room. The practical suggestion broke some of the tension. Charlotte moved to help settle the unexpected guests in one of the many spare bedrooms, while Jasmine prepared hot soup and tea. As the household gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, Charlotte found herself in the nursery with all three triplets, watching as Luke once again took up his position by the window, eyes fixed on Phantom's stable across the snow-covered yard. You knew, didn't you? She whispered to the child. Somehow, you always knew there was more to the story. Luke turned to her, his expression so serious and knowing that for a moment he seemed much older than his 11 months. Outside, Phantom emerged from his stable despite the snow, taking up his familiar watchful position facing the house. Later, that night, with the storm howling around the eaves of the old farmhouse and everyone else asleep, Charlotte sat in Daniel's study, methodically going through the files in his computer. What she found confirmed everything Sophia had told them. Detailed genetic profiles of Lin and Jung-ho, research notes on selective breeding that went far beyond horses, correspondence with Dr. Wilson that revealed the full extent of their collusion, and there, in an encrypted folder that took Charlotte hours to access, she found Daniel's true motivation. Not simple love for Lin, not mere ambition for the perfect breeding program, but a desperate attempt to fulfill the conditions of his father's will. William Reed had left the entire farm and fortune to Daniel, only on the condition that he produce worthy heirs within 5 years of his death. The definition of worthy was couched in language that made Charlotte's skin crawl, references to pure American stock, and appropriate racial characteristics that revealed the elder Reed's bigotry in stark relief. But alongside this ugly truth, Charlotte found something else, a series of increasingly desperate journal entries as Daniel gradually realized that his own genetics carried a fatal flaw, a hereditary condition that had taken his mother and would likely manifest in any biological children he fathered. His solution had been to use Jung-ho's sperm, while maintaining the fiction that the triplets were his own, thus satisfying his father's will while avoiding passing on the deadly genetic legacy. The full picture was one of a man trapped between his father's poisonous legacy and his own moral failings, making increasingly terrible choices in an effort to preserve what he valued most, not just the farm, but his connection to Lin, preserved through the children who carried her genetic material, if not his own. Dawn was breaking when Charlotte finally closed the computer, exhausted but clear-eyed. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world transformed in pristine white. Phantom remained at his post, a solitary sentinel against the snow. The sound of soft footsteps made Charlotte turn. Lin stood in the doorway, Luke in her arms. He was calling for you, she said simply, transferring the sleepy child to Charlotte's embrace. I think he sensed you were troubled. Charlotte held her son close, breathing in his warm, sweet scent. I found everything, she said. All of Daniel's files, his real reasons. Lynn nodded, unsurprised. And what will you do now? The question hung between them, laden with implications for all their futures. Charlotte looked down at Luke, who had already drifted back to sleep against her shoulder, complete in his trust. What we should have done from the beginning, she replied. Tell the truth. All of it. When Daniel's flight landed the following Tuesday, he was met not by Charlotte, alone as expected, but by a unified front, Charlotte, Lynn, Sophia, and Dr. Wilson, whom they had convinced to come forward with her full testimony about the fertility manipulation. The confrontation that followed was painful but necessary, the final lancing of a wound that had festered too long in secrecy. Daniel, faced with the full truth of his actions exposed to all the women he had deceived, broke down completely. The careful facade of control crumbled, revealing the frightened boy still trying to please a tyrannical father long after death. His confession, once started, poured out in a torrent of remorse and explanation, not justification, but the raw, ugly truth of how one compromise had led to another until he was hopelessly entangled in his own web of lies. Spring came early to Willow Creek Farm. The snow melted, revealing crocuses pushing through the mud, stubborn harbingers of renewal. The triplets celebrated their first birthday with a party that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Charlotte and Lynn working together in the kitchen, Sophia and Olivia helping with decorations, and Phantom, granted special permission, watching from just outside the open patio doors. Daniel, having completed an intensive therapy program, had moved to the guest cottage. His relationship with Charlotte fundamentally altered, but gradually healing into something more honest, if less conventional. His legal maneuvering had ensured that the farm would pass equally to all three boys, regardless of biological parentage, directly challenging his father's bigoted conditions and finally breaking free from that poisonous legacy. Sophia and Olivia had not returned to their distant home, but had taken up residence in a cottage on the farm's edge, Sophia's background in agricultural finance proving invaluable to the operation's expansion. The children, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Olivia, formed a tight-knit group, their bond transcending the complicated circumstances that had brought them together. On a warm May afternoon, Charlotte stood on the hillside overlooking the training paddock, watching as Lynn worked with Phantom and a nervous new foal. Luke sat on the fence rail beside her, safely secured in her protective grip, his eyes never leaving the white horse who had changed all their lives. "You see that, Luke?" she said softly. "That's what love looks like. Not perfect, not simple, but patient and kind and true." Phantom raised his head at the sound of her voice, intelligent eyes meeting hers across the distance. The horse that had once been a silent witness to secrets and lies now stood as a symbol of something else entirely. The possibility of healing, of building something new and honest from the wreckage of the past. Luke reached out toward the horse, a smile spreading across his face as Phantom nickered in response. A private communication between two souls who had recognized each other from the beginning, who had seen past the human complexities to something more essential. Some bonds can't be explained, Lynn had said once, watching Luke and Phantom together. They can only be honored. And so they had, all of them, honoring the unexpected connections that had brought them together, the truth that had set them free, and the love that had emerged against all odds from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. Not a conventional family by any measure, but a true one nonetheless, built on choices made in courage rather than fear. As the sun began its descent behind the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows across the rolling pastures of Willow Creek Farm, Charlotte felt a peace she had never known before, not the false calm of ignorance, but the hard-won serenity of those who have faced difficult truths and chosen to build something beautiful from them. Phantom galloped across the paddock, his white coat gleaming in the golden light, powerful and free. Luke laughed with delight at the sight, and Charlotte held him close, grateful beyond words for the silent witness who had brought them all, at last, to where they truly belonged. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Luke and Phantom has touched your heart. If you want to experience more emotional journeys like this one, subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments what moved you most. Remember, every story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, love and truth will always find a way to shine through.